Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I'm Michael Clements, the Director for International Programs at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and we are delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar on shared priorities for a just transition, rights and renewable energy value chains. Our intention for today's event is really to open space for multi-stakeholder exchange and for dialogue on one of the foremost human rights and, of course, environmental challenges of our time, the climate crisis, and what to do about it. And it's that second part, what to do about it, where we'll hopefully spend most of our time today. We're seeking to really dig into the opportunity that the critically urgent global transition to clean energy can represent for companies and for investors, certainly, but also for states, and perhaps most importantly, for frontline communities who are often Indigenous communities in this context, and for workers. Many of you will know well that these groups are already being tasked with hosting transition mineral mines through to renewable energy operations on their lands and facing new worlds of work in order to facilitate the global energy shift. We also have to acknowledge the human and environmental rights defenders who are working tirelessly in many contexts across the globe to ensure that the transition is undertaken not at the expense of these rights, but rather in a way that respects and centers them. And it's worth noting that according to the Resource Center's research, mining remains the single most dangerous sector for defenders, followed in some regions by renewable energy itself. But what will hopefully be reflected in today's discussion is that the transition doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be a fast transition that undermines rights or a just one that proceeds at a snail's pace. This is about shared priorities because it has to be. And that's because the scope and the scale of the energy transition is unprecedented, and the staggering numbers that we've all heard back this up. We know that meeting the challenge of the transition requires new investment of approximately $5 trillion by some estimates into the growing renewable energy sector, for example. And we know that the extraction of transition minerals has to increase transition will require unprecedented coalescence around a for the project of the transition is as important, if not more, as the financing that will underwrite it and the minerals and the land that are required to power it. So the point of shared priorities, why we're here, how do we get there? And I know the discussion today will shed a lot of really important light on challenge, but also these opportunities. But at a minimum, a transition that's underpinned by three core principles of respect for human rights through real and robust due diligence, commitment to fair negotiation, and commitment to shared prosperity with all stakeholders can result in the kind of public support that's essential to ensuring we're able to meet the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement. We all know, of course, that time is of the essence, and a transition that can't proceed with speed will likely be no transition at all. But in order to be fast, evidence increasingly points to the fact that it also has to be fair. Rising examples of protest and resort to court where it's not fair pose a real threat to the transition. At the Resource Center, we track, as many of you know, human rights policy and practice across the renewable energy value chain. So from the extraction of transition minerals through to solar and wind energy deployment. And while our analysis generally demonstrates real progress in respect of corporate human rights policy across the value chain, in practice, there's room for significant improvement. And we'll hear more about that today, I know, beginning with the remarks from our keynote speaker on the extractive portion of the renewable energy value chain. Our forthcoming renewable energy benchmark, which will be published next month, will also bring this issue into sharp relief. But fortunately, research also reveals examples of much better practice that can be replicated. And I know we're going to consider some of these examples in more depth over the course of this discussion, but it's certainly worth noting up front the co-benefit and co-equity models that we're seeing established between companies and communities, and the important role that Indigenous leadership in particular is playing in the development of those examples. More to come on each of those topics over the course of the next 90 minutes as Damilola and our other panelists reflect not only on our shared priorities, but also our shared opportunity to deliver through the transition real shared prosperity with good jobs, resilient livelihoods, healthier environments, and thriving communities. With that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Olga Martin Ortega, the Resource Center's head of Just Transition, to introduce properly our keynote speaker, whose remarks will be followed by a discussion with a panel of true experts from a range of disciplines and backgrounds, and then a Q&A session with all of you. Let me say another big thank you to everyone for being here at what I know are late hours for some and early for others. And I'll hand over to Olga to begin the session. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with this remarkable panel and to be able to, as Michael says, showcase some of the shared priorities that we all have in the just and fair and fast transition. And it's an absolute pleasure to have Professor Damilola Olawuyi as our keynote speaker. As you all know, Professor Olawuyi is now the chairperson of the UN Business and Human Rights Working Group since July this year. But he's also an international lawyer and well-recognized expert on business and human rights and petroleum, energy, and environmental law. He holds several positions at different universities, including the Damilola University in Nigeria and the University in Doha in Qatar. He's also a member of the Institute of Oil and Gas and Energy and Sustainable Development in Damilola University, and finally he's a senior counsel and arbitrator at McNair International Law Firm. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Damilola, and it's fantastic as well that we have the opportunity to discuss this report that the UN Working Group has just presented at the UN General Assembly. So we are very privileged to be able to have hopefully one of the first insights into the report. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olga, for the very kind introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to join you today. As Olga mentioned, it's a privilege to be able to share with you first after I made this presentation just a few days ago at the UN General Assembly. So I want to say a big thank you to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for coming up with such a fantastic idea and for providing us the opportunity as a working group to share our insights with wider stakeholders. The working group appreciates the work and support of the Resource Center, especially your contribution to our call for input, which we always find very, very helpful and insightful. As you've already mentioned, this report aimed to examine evidence of human rights abuse in the context of energy transition. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, of course, a growing number of states, businesses have come up with energy transition programs. While these energy transition programs are important, of course, there is a need for the world to halt the climate emergency. But of course, we've also seen concerns as to how the design and implementation of such programs may be exacerbating human rights challenges on the ground, most especially the sourcing of critical transition minerals needed to drive the transition. Of course, we received evidence of land grabs, forced displacements, child labor, modern slavery, discrimination and environmental pollution, that are associated with energy transition programs. And so it was our decision as a working group to shed our light on this issue and examine how can we achieve a just and inclusive energy transition that does not replicate or exacerbate adverse human rights impact in local communities and in countries. And before I share those insights of some of the things we found, I think in the introductory remarks, you made a very good point, which is that energy transition should advance sustainable development. And sustainable development, as we've always understood it, cuts across social, environmental, and economic dimensions. So a key question to ask will then be, how can we ensure that the transition does not erode progress made? For example, on the environmental pillar, the right to clean and healthy and sustainable environment, which was a landmark resolution that we've all celebrated. How can we then ensure that efforts to advance the energy transition does not then lead to environmental pollution in local communities, thereby impacting their right to clean and healthy environment? How can we advance in the economic pillar? You look at the issue of decent jobs, economic growth, which is a key pillar of the SDGs. But we've also seen evidence of people, especially in carbon-intensive sectors, losing their jobs, with the government in many countries not providing suitable alternatives for them. In the report, we cited statistics by the International Labour Organization, which would be very worrisome to many. How many people are losing their jobs in carbon-intensive sectors without any plan to sort of give them the training and alternate economic opportunities to be able to maintain the decent employment, economic growth, as well as zero poverty, which is a key pillar of the SDGs. And then when you look at the social pillar, it even becomes more worrisome, because the social pillar will then include human rights, issues relating to ensuring that energy transition programs does not then worsen conditions such as modern slavery. And we saw a report saying that the clean energy transition sector is increasingly associated with modern slavery. We saw issues, for example, in the DRC, in which you have a rise. Of course, the DRC is home to, more than 50% of the world's cobalt resources. And of course, cobalt is very useful in making electric vehicles and these technologies that we need for the transition. But you've seen, studies showing that the rush for transition minerals, the rush for cobalt, is leading to exponential increase in child labor. We've seen children as young as 7 being forced to work in cobalt and coltan mines in order to meet demand for cobalt. And so these are very worrisome challenges. And of course, studies show that the rush for cobalt is going to rise 5-fold in the next few years. And if the rush for cobalt rises 5-fold, then it should worry someone that human rights impact may also rise 5-fold or 15-fold if we don't pay close attention to these issues. So this was the context in which we decided to examine and investigate how we could design just, inclusive energy transition programs that do not exacerbate adverse human rights impact, and how can we ensure that there is indeed greater coherence in such efforts. Of course, I would want you to read the report, so I would not give you all the findings, but I will summarize some of them just very briefly. Of course, what we found is that the design of energy transition programs is characterized by 3 things: imbalance, fragmentation, and inconsistency. And I would explain each of them very briefly. By imbalance, we found that the international human rights law recognizes the rights of every state to use their resources to advance economic growth. But we see that some countries may be worse off if international solidarity to assist them is not in place. So, for example, you've seen a number of resource-rich but energy-poor countries in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, being unable to maintain economic growth, seeing their economic growth constrained, seeing their ability to finance water, energy, and infrastructure constrained as a result of the defunding of the carbon-intensive sector. Of course, the defunding of the carbon-intensive sector is essential to all the climate emergency, because the report emphasizes the need for zero carbon policies, as a matter of fact, if we must meet efforts to halt the climate emergency. But the key question we ask is, as we implement zero carbon efforts and policies, how can we then increase international solidarity and financing and support for these countries so that they do not become the sacrificial lamb for the energy transition, which is one of the key concerns that we received in terms of the feedback, that some countries in these regions that I've mentioned that are still struggling with energy poverty fear that they might indeed become the sacrificial lamb for the energy transition. And of course, that concern is also tied to imbalance in terms of impact of the transition for workers in different sectors. You see that workers in carbon-intensive sectors as well fear that they may become the sacrificial lamb. So there is indeed a need to ensure that there is a way to integrate, to ensure that no community, no society, no country is left behind in the energy transition. In terms of fragmentation, what we see is a situation whereby there are many policies in different aspects of the transition, but some of them are not only contradictory, but they provide mixed results. So, for example, a number of countries have said, we've released net zero plans, but again, they are also approving new licenses for mining projects and for oil and gas projects, and we see that as showing that there is indeed a disconnect between the intention and what we're seeing on the ground. And that disconnect is closely tied to fragmentation of efforts. You see that climate programs are supervised by some ministries, human rights programs by other ministries, and lack of interoperability may be resulting in that fragmentation, which is providing the third impact that I mentioned of inconsistency. And when we even examined inconsistency, we saw even more worrisome trends in which a number of countries and businesses are saying, oh, we are advancing net zero, but reports show that greenwashing has become so prevalent. Lack of consistent standards in measuring what net zero is, what counts as net zero progress, has resulted in very, very worrisome trend of greenwashing. And we, in the report, we mentioned some cases. You see, a report showing that most of the claims to energy transition are not only fraudulent, but just ambiguous and couched in languages that even local communities may not understand. So as a result of these three trends, the report then began to look at how can we strengthen energy transition programs based on the UNGPs. There is a need to ensure that energy transition programs do not create new forms of human rights and environmental abuses, including poverty, corruption, and conflict risks. So in the report, we provided some very action-oriented recommendations on how we can address these issues of inconsistency, fragmentation, and overlaps that I've discussed. To state, we said there's of course a clear need for clear and comprehensive regulatory framework to achieve the energy transition targets in a just and human right-based manner. And of course, for countries that do not yet have national action plans on business and human rights, we included very sharp recommendations there that there is a need for countries to begin to adopt national action plans on business and human rights, and even legislation that set that consistent standard on what energy transition should, what a just energy transition should indeed look like on the ground. Of course, we also identified in the report the need to review current extractive sector fiscal programs to ensure that they recognize the right to benefit sharing. And in fact, one of the key inconsistencies we saw also was the rise in litigation relating to efforts by states to implement net zero programs. Because of course, in the extractive sector, many of the contracts are long-term. So a situation whereby you've already signed a 30-year contract, and then you are introducing a net zero or energy transition law or climate law, and then we've seen a rise in litigation in this area, which shows that without careful efforts, some of the existing contract may constrain efforts by states to advance energy transition. So we've called for states to review and renegotiate as a matter of urgency some of the existing extractive contracts and concessions in order to remove any regulatory constraints. And of course, for businesses, we called for a clear need to integrate, to align their business practices, processes, and governance structures with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and of course with the UNGPs. Of course, we called for businesses to avoid greenwashing and misleading claims on energy transition programs through clear, credible, transparent reporting. And of course, I'll mention that we also recommended to businesses to use their leverage over their business relationship and supply chains to prevent, reduce, or mitigate energy transition-related human rights impact. I will leave it at that because I want you to pick the report and read it, but I want to end by saying a big thank you once again to all the stakeholders, especially the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, for your continued support for our mandate, and we look forward to our future collaborations. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damilola. It's certainly very interesting to hear your remarks and very good and insightful to read the report, which has lots of examples of regulatory systems that actually mean an obstacle and provide an obstacle for a just and fast transition, especially for certain communities and vulnerable groups, and for lack of access to remedies. So we will unpick some of these themes with now our fantastic panel that I will introduce. Just let me briefly remind our audience that they can put their questions in the Q&A chat while the conversation develops, and then we'll address them at the end. So, as I said, we're very fortunate to have this panel of experts on related topics today. I will turn now to them to offer their reflections on the report, but as well as the pressing issues of the just energy transition more generally and related to their work specifically. So I'll introduce them first. We are absolutely privileged to have Joanne Carling with us, which is the Executive Director of Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, IPRI. Joanne is an Indigenous human rights activist and environmentalist from the Philippines who has been defending the rights of Indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples for over 2 decades. She has served as Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and she has received in 2018 the Champion of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award from UN Environment. Welcome, Joanne. Our next speaker, we're also very privileged to have Ilan Sukman, which is the Managing Director for Latin America and 350.org, which I'm sure Ilan will tell us a little bit more about specifically the work that your organization does. And Ilan was previously Acting Manager Director for the region for Latin America and has worked as a consultant prior to joining. And welcome, Ilan. Last but not least, of course, Stephen Heim, who is the Managing Director of Boston Common Asset Management, which is a globally recognized sustainable investment firm and a leader in global impact initiatives. Stephen himself has over 25 years of experience in the responsible investment field, with particular focus on the rights of Indigenous people, as well as the just energy transition. Stephen serves in the boards of Cultural Survival and International Funders for Indigenous People, and is on the steering group committee for Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group. So we are absolutely privileged to have you as well, Stephen. Welcome. And I think to start the debate, maybe I'll turn with my first question to you. As you know, and you're working really closely right at the heart of these issues, meeting the challenge for the clean energy transition requires an unprecedented redirection of investment flows into the growing sector of renewable energy sector. and where we have a current investment gap that has been estimated to be some $5 trillion US dollars. And this presents a significant opportunity for private capital and institutional investors in the context of the transition. But as we know, this has to happen very quickly. We are in the midst of this urgency. So in light of the critical need for speed, how can we realize the increase in investment in renewable energies and transitional minerals mining projects while also ensuring investors fulfill their own responsibility and that of their investees to respect human rights?
Thank you. I'm honored to be on the panel with everyone today in this discussion that we're having. I'll talk just on a few different areas. One is on the pace or the rush or the speed for the energy transition, and what are some areas that investors and companies should be considering as part of ways to reduce that pace and the speed and the rush. But first is a key area of human rights due diligence that investors need to do in looking at potential projects that they might invest in, either on a project basis, such as by banks or those that buy into renewable energy projects, and then also for investors and companies, and how are their portfolio companies operating in this area of the energy transition and respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. We can look just recently to the Dakota Access Pipeline and the catastrophe that happened there when the banks assumed that the US government's processes for project review were sufficient for the Dakota Access Pipeline. That led major banks to revise the Equator Principles, because 13 of the 17 banks that financed the Dakota Access Pipeline were signatories to the Equator Principles. But that is just a start. Investors should also ask that the companies that they are investors in adopt policies on free prior informed consent and also respect the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. National governments, as I noted, won't protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Up and down the supply chain, investors should be looking for that. Also is looking at the life cycle cost of projects. What's the full life of the project from early development to actual end of life? Investors should be asking for companies to have bonds to recover the fixing up or the retirement of projects. And the last two things I'll mention is on the pace and the speed. We shouldn't forget about the need to chop down the overall demand, reduce the demand for transition minerals and for renewable energy projects themselves through design to use less minerals, recovery or circular economy principles for whether it be solar or wind power projects and their equipment. And lastly is on the pace of chopping down the demand is the role of energy efficiency or energy productivity, which is ignored mostly by investors. Companies are looking at that, but I think it is a key area. And as Amory Levin said in his paper, how big is the energy efficiency resource? It's huge. And I think that those are things that we should do immediately first, along with, besides pushing for renewable energy at the expense of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. The really important reflections regarding speed and how we need to take into account Indigenous people, which I'm gonna now move on to John to elaborate further on, and especially as well the need for degrowth, or at least to design an economy that requires less consumption of this mineral. So, Joan, as you've reflected elsewhere, we know that Indigenous people rights are key within the transition, and Stephen has also brought this perspective. They are not also key for the transition, but key for its success. And as we know, some studies have revealed that more than half of the transition minerals resource base is located on or near the lands of Indigenous peoples and peasants communities. equally, most of the vast lands that we have to use to deploy renewable energy projects are in lands that have traditionally been considered less attractive for other uses. So these groups, Indigenous peoples and peasant communities, are two groups whose rights to consultation and free, prior, and informed consent is embedded in United Nations declarations and is very commonly violated. So can you reflect on what are the critical impacts of transition mining and indeed renewable energy projects on Indigenous people? And as well, but we can hear some context on the way Indigenous peoples need to be respected and be put at the heart of a just transition.
Thanks for that question, Olga. And it's good that I'm coming after two excellent speakers. So with the impacts, because I can elaborate further to what they already mentioned, I want to mention 5 key impacts to Indigenous peoples by the conduct of the transition mineral now, including also the imposition of renewable energy projects in Indigenous territories. First is the increasing cases, alarming cases of conflicts. And that will double or even triple given that more than 50% of the transition minerals are indigenous in Indigenous territories. And the reason for these conflicts is because of it already exacerbates the existing systematic violation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. We are treated without rights. We are treated as if we don't exist and only our resources matter and not us. And that is why a lot of course, Indigenous peoples will take action to defend their rights in the face of this. Unfortunately, the response is repression, criminalization, and attacks to environment defenders when we defend our lands from mining and from also the imposition of energy projects. And the reason also why Indigenous peoples are really standing up to protect our rights is because of the impacts of these projects, such as forced displacement, pollution of river bodies, or lack, affecting water sources and rivers, destruction of biodiversity, which is also very important to our cultural heritage, destruction of our sustainable food systems, increasing vulnerability of abuse to women. These are all the impacts that is already happening in many of these projects. So that's also the point that I want to stress, including, of course, the environmental impact that I already mentioned. And then finally, also to mention that because of these impacts of transition minerals, we can see this in the Philippines for nickel, for example, in countries like Bolivia, Argentina, Chile on the lithium, DRC has been mentioned already, on the cobalt, and in Russia in nickel, but also in the renewable energy like the solar, for example, in Kenya, in Norway, in Mexico, and also in India and other parts. So conflicts are happening in these countries, and the impacts that I have mentioned earlier. And as a response to this, Indigenous peoples are using now the legal system to defend and protect our rights. So there are now positive rulings by Supreme Courts asserting the rights of Indigenous peoples against this kind of imposition in this renewable energy project. And for sure, this will increase in the coming period because Indigenous peoples has nowhere to go. We've already sacrificed our lands in the past. And again, we are expected to sacrifice in the name of green colonization, and we will not allow this to happen. So there will be more struggles on the ground. There will be more actions by indigenous peoples, because we need to defend our rights to this kind of imposition that is completely violating our rights and our dignity and our well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. This exemplifies very well the massive impact that the turn to low carbon economy brings with it for indigenous peoples and communities, and also the risks to a fast transition due to the cost of opposition and conflict if we continue to do use the same business models that we've used so far. So, Ilan, there's a related question, and you work very much in the climate and environmental field, and as we know, climate change, of course, is one of the greatest and most urgent issues as a threat to human rights. And so the energy transition that we urgently need come with its own risks in this term. So with the global dialogue around the energy transition, that, as we know, is an increasingly crowded space. What are your thoughts about marrying the need for a very swift transition with the needs for global clean energy systems that heed the lessons from the past and avoid repetition of business models that have brought in the past this devastation and human rights violations?
Sure, thanks for the question, Olga, and for the invitation. Hi everyone. Well, that's a very hard question, of course, to answer. But as my colleagues before me were saying, like Damilola touched in very important points, that we can't leave anyone behind in this transition. Steve was referring to important points like consumption and production, energy efficiency, circular economy, the need to design things in a way that use less minerals. And lastly, Joanne was referring, of course, to the sad amount of conflicts based on renewable energy minerals for the renewable transition extraction. So we have a big challenge ahead of us. We have like calculations that are telling us that we need to add 1.5 terawatts of renewable energy per year if you would like to keep our planet in a warming maximum 1.5 degrees. But at the same time, we need to add more renewable energy, but we can't have any new fossil fuel projects, right? No more coal, no more gas, no more oil. So we can't go straight to renewable and keep the fossil fuel companies with the same amount of power than they have in this world. We can't replicate the same model. This model failed on us. We are seeing the consequences of climate change across the world, and we can't simply give the energy transition to the same hands of the same companies that led us to these catastrophic climate events, which are the fossil fuel companies supported by a huge amount of governments in this world. So it's very important that the energy transition is led by communities, is led by scientists, is led by people that really care about the environment and have the tools to protect it. In one hand, we need to advance in a faster rhythm, but if we go too fast, we will replicate the same models that we are seeing here. So it's important for us to enforce some tools in the middle of this transition, like, for example, the consultation of indigenous and traditional communities. I'm coming from Brazil, and in Latin America, we have a huge amount of countries that have ratified the Convention 169 from the International Labour Organization, trying to guarantee a free, prior, and informed consultation to communities before any projects start in their territories. We have really nice examples in Latin America where the consultation is enforced, but sometimes, of course, we need to go to the courts, for example, for this consultation to really happen. So I believe that we also, something important for us to do is go where the money is, right? There's lots of money in this world, but the money now is concentrated still in the hands of an old economy, a dirty economy, So what we should be doing is getting this money from, for example, the big profits of the fossil fuel companies. They got more money than I don't know who in the last years with of course the war in Europe, and this money is just making them go to do new fossil fuel projects instead of advancing the transition. They have in their portfolio more than 90% of fossil fuel projects and about 4% of, oh, I'm doing the energy transition. I have 4% of my portfolio of renewable projects, and these renewable projects are replicating the same models of the fossil fuel industry. So there's lots of greenwashing in the fossil fuel sector now. The net zero is being really hard to follow. There are no guidelines. There's no one really tracking it. And the last thing I wanted to touch is about the huge amount of fossil fuel subsidies that we have in this planet. We're seeing only increasing the amount of fossil fuel subsidies in this world, whereas for the renewable energy sector, the subsidies are not even close to what we're seeing for the fossil fuel industry. So of course, the fossil fuel subsidies are important to a certain amount of the population, especially the poor, for energy bills, for people to get heat warm inside of their homes. But fossil fuel companies are billionaires, trillionaires. Why we keep like putting lots of subsidies to fossil fuel executives to get only richer at the cost of wrecking the climate in our planet?
Thank you very much, Ilan. This is an important point as well. This your last point that actually the UN Working Group report makes very clear as well in the report, is like the existence of systems that incentivize the continuation of fossil fuels, and also the inconsistencies and lack of clear regulatory frameworks for just transition, make just transition plans accountable. And also you made an important point about, you know, where the money is concentrated in certain sectors, and who needs to be able to redistribute this money. And this leads me to bring back Stephen and as the money person. As we've been hearing, we've been hearing the negative impacts of the human rights and the environment that the renewable energy value chain and transitional minerals are bringing. But of course, we do have a brighter side, or we hope to bring a brighter side as well to the discussion and to highlight this shared priorities. So Stephen, we've documented a growing trend of Indigenous peoples increasingly seeking more ownership and control of renewable energy projects, including from mineral extraction to deployment of, for example, solar and wind. And this includes co-ownership arrangements with developers in many parts of the world. We have examples, and my colleagues have put in the chat our hub, our joint hub with IPRI on shared prosperity and Indigenous leadership in renewable energy projects, where we highlight examples from Canada, from the US, but also from Kenya, New Zealand, and elsewhere. So what's your view on this trend and other priority opportunities for the private sector, for business and investors to meaningfully contribute to the realization of a just transition for all?
Back to, okay, I'm ready again. So a key area for investors is looking at the life of the project versus taking a transactional approach to whether it be co-owned or solely owned by Indigenous peoples, rather than replacing what Ilan described with fossil fuel companies and just slapping on the name. Now they're a green energy company doing the same practices. You know, that's going to be terrible for the Indigenous peoples there. The other notion of brighter, I would like to have people check out a book called Bright Green Lies, which looks at the sort of rosy promises of green energy, but really looking at it as what's the impact on the earth and the people there. So we have to address those as how we do the projects and do them right. On self-determination and ownership, I think that is a key area where the co-ownership, just ownership. I mentioned a couple projects in Masai of Kenya are developing the Old Unio Onyoki geothermal power project in Kenya. Another, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which is the main tribal nation that was fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline, have launched their Anpetuwi wind farm project, which will be 235 megawatts of power, 60 turbines, which is actually less than the Lake Turkana 310 megawatt project, but this one would be owned by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and their tribal power authority. But how would this actually go forth, both investing in these kind of projects, but also on the renewable energy commitments of companies to include Indigenous ownership or co-ownership of renewable energy that they're sourcing should be a key part of the package, and not just that it says that it's solar or wind. What's underneath that solar and winds? And again, I mentioned before on a supply chain, human rights, and environmental sustainability, such as the new EP standard, EPEAT for solar, and then for purchase power agreements with Indigenous or Native owned utilities is another area that investors really have to consider as ways that they could advance this, but again, in respecting the rights and cultures and lands of Indigenous peoples.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. Very insightful as well. Then I'm going now to Joan again, and as well after these reflections and this important elements that Stephen is pointing as building the relationship with Indigenous people as key part of the whole investment package. We know as well of the problems, but also renewable energies and the transition creates a lot of opportunities as well, and creates but hopefully it can open a space for Indigenous-led solutions to the core part of to be a core part of the solution to this climate crisis. So giving a real seat at the table for Indigenous communities in a just transition is not only something that may look good in your project development, but it's essential to avoid conflicts, and as you said, to defend the Indigenous human rights defenders from attacks, but also to build a sustainable global energy model. So what are the opportunities within the transition for ensuring respect for Indigenous leadership, and particularly for advancing new business models that center community co-ownership, co-equity, and other possibilities of real shared benefit, not just revenue sharing, one revenue sharing here or there?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Olga. Let me first mention that Indigenous peoples are supportive of the just transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, because this is what we need to save the planet. But what we're saying is that we need to do it right. We cannot do it the usual way, as we've seen with the massive, not only the massive violation of Indigenous people's rights, but also resulting to inequity, massive inequity and marginalization of Indigenous people. So this will have to be addressed if we want for Indigenous peoples to really contribute, because after all, it's our asset, it's our land and resources that are going to be used. And we need respectful partnerships and collaboration to do this. And for this, one is that we need the respect and protection of Indigenous people's rights as an enabling environment, and in order to address the power imbalance. Because unless we start from the point of view of the respect for our rights, we will not be in the same equal on the same, even if we sit on the same table, we're not equal in that sense, right? We will not be treated as a partner if we are not regarded with our rights and the contributions that we are making. So that is imperative. And when I say recognition of our rights, that has to be underpinned by the first respect for our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, our right to self-determination, and thereby it requires a free, prior, and informed consent as a social license for companies and investors to come in. So that's the first thing. The second is to ensure the protection of the environment. And in order to do this, it's necessary for Indigenous peoples to be part of the environmental impact assessments, including the risks, and in identifying, if ever, there are effective mitigation measures. Because without the participation of Indigenous peoples in the conduct of these assessments, our perspectives will not be taken into account. The cultural dimensions, for example, that are intangible, will not be there. What if they want to build in our sacred sites, right? Those are the things that we need to prevent, and that can only be done with our effective participation in those processes to ensure the protection of the environment as well as our cultural heritage and livelihoods and food systems. The third is to ensure equitable terms of agreements, and this is just not only a provision for sharing of revenue, but also ensuring that Indigenous peoples will be provided with the energy, and that will also serve our economic empowerment, including women. I mean, it's so ironical that we are hosting so many renewable energy projects, but we're not even getting the energy, or we cannot even afford to pay for it. So that's one, and also to ensure sustainable livelihoods for Indigenous peoples and ensuring cohesion, all right, for Indigenous peoples, that we are not that the benefits should not be used to divide and rule Indigenous communities, because that often happens. And also, four point is to build respectful partnerships based on trust, with effective mechanisms of continuous engagements and dialogue, and to also ensure that there is a mechanism for conflict resolution and addressing grievances. This is a critical element to show good faith from both sides. And finally, is to ensure long-term sustainability. We cannot engage in a partnership with a very short term, because we are trying to solve the climate crisis, and we need to have sustainability, and this sustainability should also include sustainability of the benefits for Indigenous communities beyond the project life. Because especially if our resources are already destroyed, like for example mining, how will Indigenous communities survive? And also the rehabilitation of devastated areas, for example, needs to be there. So these are at least the minimum 5 necessary steps to ensure strong partnership and collaboration with Indigenous peoples for this common agenda that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. And this is many of the issues that you've highlighted are specifically, as you said, ironic that we're trying to move into a just energy transition that doesn't guarantee access to energy to many communities. And as the UN Working Group report mentions several times, the lack of effective remedies for conflict is one of the big hurdles in this process. So Ilan, I'd like to pose a final question to you before I give the floor again to Damilola. And this one is more focused on the Latin America context. And we know that 350 has played a crucial role in encouraging dialogue and action in respect of the just energy transition globally, which is a central issue in Latin America, where there's a vast amounts of transitional minerals reserves and great opportunity for renewable energy development, including for development, socioeconomic development. So what does Latin America need from governments, investors, and companies in order to ensure that the region is able to leverage the transition in a way that is not only helpful for the world, but for the region itself.
All right. Well, Latin America, we are really a vast and rich area of the world in terms of resources. Joan was referring earlier to the lithium reserves in Latin America. We have what is called the lithium triangle in Latin America, the areas of Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, with about 60% of the lithium in the world. Mexico has also some big reserves. Brazil is starting to extract as well lithium, but of course it's not about lithium. We also have like lots of copper, cobalt, and many other important reserves. But unfortunately, what we're seeing now in Latin America is Latin America is still being pushed, especially by countries from the global north, to continue as our role as a provider and only like exporting raw resources to the world, instead of trying to develop our own economy, our own social benefits that can come from the energy transition. So right now we're seeing, for example, all of the extraction of lithium going to the batteries for electric vehicles in the US, in Canada, in Europe. This lithium is not staying like in any of the countries for trying to do a green industrialization of the countries, to try to increase the amount of jobs instead of trying to move the jobs from the fossil fuel sector to the renewable sector. We're just being pushed to extract all of that without any plan to benefit the economy of Latin America. I think it's also important to mention that the energy transition is not about technology. It's about social benefits. It's about transforming our economy. We can't simply just switch from one technology to other. We need to transform, do a deeper transformation. It needs to be a systemic change. It's not going to, that's why it's so hard, and it's not going to be fast. But we are seeing that the renewable energy sector can already generate more jobs than the fossil fuel sector. For example, we are seeing that the technology is getting better and better. There are now practices trying to impact less when extracting these minerals. Of course, there's still like lots of impacts. We are going to have impacts extracting minerals, but we need to have a discussion about like who this is going to benefit, what's going to be the technique to extract, and of course the consultation that I mentioned before to communities is critical, because then communities can understand what's going to happen, then they can put their opinion, they can see if this is going to benefit their territories or not, because in many cases this is only benefiting the big industrial complex. People impacted by energy projects don't even receive the energy coming from this project. This energy is going only to very far centers. So I think we need like a deeper discussion. And Latin America needs, of course, to do real partnerships. We are seeing the jet piece happening across the planet in places like Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam. And so far what we're hearing is that it's not being just at all. So in order for something to really be just, we need to involve all of different stakeholders, civil society, the third sector, impacted communities, the government, the people that are going to put the money, investors, banks. This, in my opinion, was the moment that I saw the best projects connected to renewable energy, when we were able to gather and listen to the different opinions of multiple stakeholders and find common ground. Because if you go only with the logic of the market, we'll be pushed like in a new economy, but it's going to replicate the fossil fuel model. So that's what I believe it's needed for Latin America, but also to other parts of the world, especially the global south, like Africa, Asia, the Pacific, areas of the world that are always like contributing so much to the economy of the global north, but the majority of the time suffering the majority of the impacts.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Very insightful as well. So before I open the Q&A, and we've seen that you've been putting your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we will start making them public as we address them to the panelists. I would like to give the final floor to Damilola to, of course, thank you again for your insightful remarks to open the session, and thank you for the efforts of the UN Working Group to spotlight the critical issues of human rights in the transition, and particularly in the context of transitional minerals. And before we open the session for questions from the audience, what is for you the most important takeaway from the report for stakeholders in thinking about the future of the energy transition, and from the discussions that you heard today?
Thank you, Olga. It's been really wonderful today, and I think I've been taking notes, and I think the working group would have a lot to use to continue to raise awareness on these issues. So it's been really great. I think the key takeaway for me will be that there cannot be a sustainable transition without human rights. There is a clear need to dismantle several of the pre-existing human rights concerns in the extractive sector and in many other sectors, because what we see is that we're trying to layer energy transition on pre-existing human rights problems. Whether we're talking about lack of gender inclusion, before now the extractive sector has often been described as a men's club, whether we're talking about lack of free prior informed consent of indigenous communities, this has been pre-existing, and we are just layering the transition. The search for transition minerals is just replicating those pre-existing challenges, or even lack of data, or issues of lack of transparency and green capitalism. So there is a clear need to ensure that we dismantle those pre-existing challenges. A just transition should not focus only on achieving environmental sustainability as quickly as possible, but should try to avoid replicating some of these pre-existing problems. And I think that is where we all play key roles as human rights advocates. We need to continue to ask for the inclusion of human rights language in energy transition programs. We need to continue to serve as advocates for access to remedies. We need to continue to use our voice and platform to raise awareness that we need to integrate the UNGPs and human rights standards in energy transition programs. And of course, we, in the report, we had some, we highlighted some practices that are emerging in this area. And of course, we highlighted the important effort by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in maintaining the transition minerals tracker, which has been very key in highlighting cases of human rights abuses related to transition minerals. We highlighted examples from the Accountability Council as well. They have this Accountability Console, which has a database of many of the cases before development bans, or now their projects may be exacerbating human rights on the ground. We want more of such efforts that will continue to spotlight human rights issues in the energy transition. And I think if we can do this, then we will be able to achieve a transition that is just, that is inclusive and orderly as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's hopeful remarks as well. And I think working together, we can see that actually we are capable of doing this, and we should feel as such. So we have many interesting questions in the Q&A, and I can see that some have been answered as well by Joan, but I would like to pick up on two themes that I can see that have appeared in a couple of questions. One is more focused on what should business do? So what is the recommendations for business? What is the action of businesses themselves? And maybe I can address this one to Joan and Stephen as well, with what are we asking businesses to do? And obviously the UN Working Group has a long recommendations for how to frame the just transition and the corporate responsibility to respect in the UN guiding principles. But maybe Joan, if you can tell us, how do we ensure that companies take up these recommendations as well that you've mentioned?
Yes, I think companies should need to put into action the commitments that they made. For example, there's a lot of voluntary guidelines for respect for human rights and FPIC, but this is not being taken into action. It's very clear there's a huge gap. It's called on the FPIC of companies with the study done by Oxfam, where mining companies do not have policy on free, prior, and informed consent, and even more on the respect for Indigenous people's rights. So we need companies to have explicit policy on the respect for Indigenous people's rights and to accept that FPIC is a social license to operate. So that's one. Second is for them to establish an engagement mechanism with Indigenous peoples directly. We need to engage in a dialogue and discussion on how we are impacted and to ensure that we participate in the conduct of environmental and social impact studies. And third is the establishment of grievance mechanism that is effective, that Indigenous peoples have effective access to these grievance mechanisms. These are three basic or fundamental steps that companies can take so that Indigenous people's rights are not only respected, but it provides the avenue or the enabling environment to establish partnerships with Indigenous peoples.
Great, thank you. And Stephen, would you like to add?
Well, Joan put it very well. I think that the main thing I'd add is there's a role of investors and banks who are financing projects, and then investors who are shareholders in companies, but then the companies themselves. So from the investor viewpoint, I would say what's important is to be sure that the companies have Indigenous people's rights policies. For example, there was a study done by First Peoples Worldwide on global auto companies, and almost none of them had policies on Indigenous people's rights. And that's critical for energy transition and sourcing of lithium or other minerals that go into the batteries that cars of the future and presently will be having for electric vehicles. So that is a key area, is for companies to adopt the policy, but then also the follow through, and for them to demonstrate how are they actually having, it's termed human rights due diligence of their practices and operations, and investors have to hold them accountable. And fortunately, governments are also starting to do that, such as in Europe, as far as requiring human rights due diligence.
Great, thank you. Ellen, there's a question specifically posed for you as well, with someone that agrees with your remarks about fossil fuels, but how can we meaningfully engage the private sector? And we could imagine a scenario where we only act against relevant industries.
Well, thanks for the question. So, of course, the private sector has a huge role to play and help us to advance the energy transition and also tackle the climate crisis. But we have, how can I say this, had good guys and bad guys in all different sectors of our society. So the private sector alone is not going to be able to advance given the high amount of challenges that we have. So I believe what we really need to have is more accountability, clear guidelines, clearer roadmaps about how we're going to move from one position to another, right? We are speaking about a transition, but has the transition started? I believe yes, but until which year are we going? What we're going to do in the middle? People and companies, they just say, oh, by 2040, by 2050, we will be net zero, or we will reduce like this percentage. But how are you going to get there? What are you going to do like in each semester or each quarter, each year to really move you there? How are you going to be accountable for all of that? We need to tighten these roadmaps. Otherwise, if there's no accountability, if there are no like fines or a sort of punishment, governments and the private sector will continue to move like business as usual, adding small amounts of renewable projects in their portfolio, but still they will continue in the same model, the model that was built in the industrial revolution without really addressing the main causes. So I think we need a multiple amount of stakeholders with clear, really guidelines and accountability possibilities to get us where we really need to be.
Great. I think, John, did you raise your hand? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, that was an accident. But
oh, okay, no problem. So, Stephen, there's a question that I think is also could be interesting for you. It's related to how to ensure the recommendations that are included, these kind of recommendations, such as the ones from the UN Working Group report, are included in ESG reporting frameworks as to measure performance. So how do we use this kind of measurements to actually properly articulate the substantive action?
Well, for one is what investors can ask of the companies that they do, but the GRI has been doing a big review. I know in the mining section was whether the GRI being the Global Reporting Initiative of, for example, requiring free prior informed consent for projects. I'm not sure how that is going to settle out, but I think that is a key area of the reporting frameworks. Unfortunately, there is an ongoing struggle of what's material. Are the respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples material? And so companies may not think that's so, or would it be required in the standard? So that's an area where everyone on the call who is concerned about this is to push for this to be part of, it is material for companies. If they don't address it, they will have projects blocked and stopped, besides the human rights abuses that may occur from their projects. So that's where I would say is just important is for these different bodies is to make your views known. In the next couple of years, the International Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, I don't know if I got the full name there, but they will be reviewing how they're looking at their materiality standards. And I think that is a key area for right now, an opportunity for us to try to push that into the basic reporting standards, even if they're voluntary for companies.
Great, thank you very much. And I'd like to conclude with one final answer to Damilola, which picks up on several of the questions that we've had, and it's to do with changing the narratives and also kind of creating, as you say in your report, a coherent regulatory environment that is both national, subnational level, but also international level, and to what extent we need to be able to make sure that we bring these cohesive narratives together, and so the just transition doesn't appear, as John pointed very well, as something that Indigenous people are against, or worker communities may fear, or so how do we make sure that these comprehensive narratives are part of our international policy and regulatory environment framework?
Thank you. I think 2 points can be made in that regard. One is that in the report, we highlighted the need for the international climate change regime itself to continue to create that coherence in terms of highlighting what the just transition means, and in terms of putting together sort of periodic guidance on how key stakeholders can advance some of these precepts. A second part is that we emphasize is the need for capacity development. We see that several of these discussions occur in capital cities, but not necessarily in the villages or in the fields where the extractive activities themselves take place. So report, I highlight the need for capacity development a lot, the need for all stakeholders to prioritize providing capacity, and we highlighted some best practices or emerging good practices in this regard. For example, with the World Bank assisted mineral sector diversification program, in which about 20,000 small-scale and artisanal miners were trained to understand how to integrate environmental issues and how to integrate human rights issues into what they're doing. So I think taking the message beyond the capital cities, taking it to where stakeholders are, will be very key. And that's why we called on states to commit greater resources to capacity development. We also called on the UN and other international organizations to advance capacity development needed as the foundation for a just transition.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think with this as well, inspiring a positive message, I think we can wrap up this session, and we can thank very much to Professor Olawuyi and to Stephen Haim and Joan Carling and Ilan Sugman for their fantastic contributions, and of course be very excited to see the UN Working Group report and the UN Working Group taking head on these massive challenges and great opportunities that we have. And it's a pleasure for the Business Human Rights Research Center to host you, and it's an absolute pleasure to have had all of you in the audience. And let's keep the conversation. It is a vital and urgent conversation that we all are invested in. Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to my colleagues Pipa and Ajatunde, who have taken care of the technical aspect. Thank you to Sonia very much for all her support, and to Michael Clemens, of course, for always inspiring us and leading us so greatly. Have a great evening, morning, afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.